Your movie this week is a real treat.
Ow! Jeez!
No.
It's
Bad.
called High School Big Shot. And,
Wrong.
there's
That
also
is
a
not
short
nice.
or something.
Bad.
This time we watch Season 6, Episode 18, High School Big Shot.
A movie that TV's Frank once described as one of the most depressing films ever made.
It's also got a short, Out of This World, about an angel and a devil in a moral battle over a bread salesman.
Yep, it's got it all, this episode.
It's got it all.
But before we talk about this episode, we should do a little follow-up. Last time we did a nice little segment in our episode on Mighty Jack about Kurt Vonnegut and about Cat's Cradle, which maybe inspired some of the quote-unquote movie. And listener Ned over at By the Bywater, a fellow podcast here at Megaphonic, all about all things Tolkien, which is lovely, and you should go listen to that if that's anywhere near your jam.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Ned reminded us that in the Amazing Colossal Episode Guide, there are a number of introductions and forewords. There's quite a lot of them. But one of them is by Kevin Murphy, and it is a foreword about Kurt Vonnegut.
Sort of. It's more a foreword about him fanboying out over Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. It's about a time when they were headed to the Cable Ace Awards in 1995, I believe, and they happened to see Kurt Vonnegut.
Like they were staying at the same hotel. Ooh, so fancy.
And Jim Mallon and the rest of them decided to talk Kevin into going up to Kurt Vonnegut and inviting him to dinner, even though, Kevin knew this was a terrible idea. And, Kurt Vonnegut was lovely, but said, no, I'm very busy tonight. And then later that night,
they saw him being busy
eating alone in the hotel restaurant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Which, as Kevin admits, was the right choice for him to make.
Well, it is very hard to, and I'm sure that they deal with this as well. Like, how do you interact with your fan base? Yeah,
we've talked about this a little bit before, but if you meet Joel and he's not like stranded by the side of the road, don't expect much out of your encounter with him.
I don't know. Do you pick up Joel on the side of the road if he's hitchhiking Art Garfunkel style? I mean, it's kind of scary. It's a scary prospect. I don't know, Chris. I don't know.
Also, I like that you suggested that Art Garfunkel, in his Walking Across America, hitchhiked much of the way. The man's a cheater. The man's a known cheat and a liar.
Well, I have no comment. I will neither confirm nor deny.
But now we're gonna tuck in with a very depressing movie. Content warnings for all the depressing stuff this episode, I suppose. But hopefully you knew that going into this. This time we watched Season 6, Episode 18, High School Big Shot.
But first, a short, Out of This World. The eternal struggle between good and evil has never been more tense. Why, there are angels and devils who wrestle over the eternal souls of even the bread delivery man. To be fair, this is the angel of capitalism and the devil of I don't give a poo. The angel wants you to be a good little salesperson and sell, sell, sell. The devil wants you to do the bare minimum, deliver the bread, and get on with your life already. They make a bet. The devil thinks that with a little temptation, the sells lots of bread delivery man could be turned back into the whatever, here's your bread guy that he used to be. The angel, of course, thinks differently. Since he has had a taste of sales success, he will be unable to stop selling. Our bread delivery man shows the angel in disguise that he knows the way to be a good salesperson. Dote upon your customers, make good bread displays with the impulse buys at eye level, the little devil, and use statistics to decide what sells well and where. The devil loses this bet, unable to turn the bread delivery man into a bad worker, and the angel of capitalism wins again. The end.
And now for our feature presentation. Meet Marvin. You can call him Marv. Marv's in high school, and he's having a rough time with it. Oh, sure, he's doing okay in classes. He knows a thing or two about Hamlet. But this only gives some students a pretext for bullying him, which his school isn't going to do anything about. His home life is also tricky. He's only got a father at home, and his father can't hold down a steady job. But Marv's life gets turned upside down one day when Betty, the prettiest girl in school, invites him to ask her out on a date. What? And that date ends with the promise of a second date? Oh, and with a little request. Would Marv help Betty with her English paper? If she doesn't get a good mark, she'll fail the course, and her abusive father will use that as a pretext to be abusive towards her. Yikes. Well, Marv is more than happy to help. In fact, he's willing to forget about going to college entirely. Why, he'll get a job at home, and they can get married and live happily ever after. This is a little more than Betty was hoping for. She really just wanted that paper. And even that turns out to be a bust, because the teacher immediately figures out that Marv wrote the paper. The teacher fails Betty and withdraws his recommendation for a scholarship for Marv, ruining 2 young lives in one fell swoop. But all is not lost. Marv has a job, remember? That's how he has a few bucks for his father to borrow. He works as a clerk at a shipping depot or something, and he overhears his bosses talk about how they're going to be holding on to some illicit money. A lot of illicit money, $1 million even. Maybe if Marv gets his hands on this money, that will be his ticket out of poverty and loneliness. Marv gets in touch with the local safecracker, sure, but also tells Betty about his plan. And Betty tells Marv's bully about the plan and tells him to steal it because she'd rather end up with him, I guess. But just because you're a bully doesn't mean you know how to pull off a heist. You want a good at high school English guy for that job. Except, well, I guess the high schooler isn't a perfect mastermind after all. He and his accomplices arrive a few minutes late, set off the alarm, and walk right into the bully, who pulls out a gun and shoots an accomplice. And then shoots Betty for convincing him to shoot that other guy. More criminals show up, and one of them shoots the bully, which causes $1 million to fall into the harbor. And then the cops show up, and they immediately shoot the real criminals and arrest Marv. It's just like Hamlet. Everybody dies in the end.
Meanwhile, on the satellite of love, Mike has a super big headache, and in typical fashion, all the bots have something very loud to do. Cymbals, bagpipes, laughter. How dare they? Mike screams for them to stop, which just offends them, and then he tries to relieve the pressure with a drill. I mean, who hasn't tried that? Dr. Forrester sends Mike a chemistry set to make an invention for the exchange, and Frank uses their chemistry set to gene splice a dinosaur into existence. Again, who hasn't done that? This dinosaur wants to eat Dr. Forrester, and there's much rending of clothing. Bad dinosaur, stop. Mike and Crow make a potion for Tom that makes him big, dumb, and violent. Fortunately, it wears off a few minutes into the movie. Inspired by the short, Mike, Crow, and Tom are dressed as bread delivery men, hawking their specialty breads. A butter-top bread studded with sticks of actual butter, that's specialty. Way, way better than the foot ointment bread. Yuck. At movie break, Mike is on a suspiciously quiet satellite of love. But then Tom and Crow come revving by in their car and throw stuff at Mike. But they sort of get it wrong, you know? They fry the egg before throwing it and rather make a subpar hollandaise sauce to throw later. But who hasn't been pelted with a little hollandaise sauce in their time? Next movie break finds Crow and Tom trying to break into GPC's diary with dynamite. While the dynamite consumes their thief outfits and blows apart their bodies, it has no effect on GPC's diary, which remains locked and unread. She sure chose the correct brand of diary for keeping her thoughts secret. In a nod to the exciting conclusion of today's experiment, Crow tries to steal the fan letter that Mike is reading and squirts him with his squirt gun. GPC comes along and Crow squirts her, accusing her of forcing him to do it. Tom is a cop who squirts Crow. GPC awakens, and this basically becomes a squirt gun fight where everyone gets wet. Dr. Forrester is tired of being intimidated by the bloodthirsty dinosaur, so he subdues it with a hammer and shoves it down Frank's pants. Oh, that stings! What do you think, sirs? Most depressing movie ever. Frank nailed it. The movie is like, can we throw the most depressing elements we can possibly think of for everything into a heist movie with like some weird character? Like, he strikes me not as a safecracker, but more as like a hustling pool player who's the safecracker. And he's almost a comic character. And the rest of the movie is just ridiculously drab. Oh, Chris, this was such a tough movie to watch.
Some people love this episode because the movie is so depressing.
I mean, they do the best they can with it. I'm going to say like they helped the watching of the movie, but everything just goes wrong all the time for this poor kid.
Yeah. And I think, again, that's what people like about it. Like, there's something, at least for some people sometimes, incredibly delightful about a movie that's so over-the-top bleak and isn't really, it's not the best movie ever made. It's not written and acted and directed to perfection. It's not Ordinary People or something like that. I have no idea. But
yeah.
So I think for some people in a particular mood, this is a very good episode for that sort of thing. And I'm definitely one of those people. If I'm in the right mood and I want to watch something this depressing, it's a good time.
It is a very specific time. I'm not sure I would call it a good time, but sure, yes. I know that we're going to talk more about Roger Corman later, but one of the things that's always associated with Roger Corman is having big monsters inside of their movies. And I'm watching this movie knowing it's a Roger Corman, and I'm just like, what's the monster? It's the girl. The girl is the monster. She's terrible. She's so mean. I mean, she tempts this guy to go out on a date with her, and he's like, oh my God, the prettiest girl in school just asked me out. This is the best day of my whole life. Nothing else I've ever done in life matters. And then, she asks him to write the paper. She even at first suggests, no, just help me with the paper. And of course, being the guy he is, he's like, no, I won't just help you with the paper. I'll write it for you. Like, who doesn't see the problem in that? Everyone sees the problem in that, except for the two of them. There's no way that's going to work. Every single movie that has this plot in some way has the like, but can you make it sound more like me? Because I don't want the teacher asking why I sound so dumb in class, but so smart in my paper.
Yeah, that doesn't occur to either of them, unfortunately. He may not actually be all that smart, it turns out.
Well, it turns out he's just not very good at being bad.
Well, that's also true, I suppose. But now, hold on a second, though, because I agree that the movie wants you to think that she's the real monster. But I do feel like the movie's not necessarily being entirely fair to her. I'm not trying to say that what she did was good or smart, but she is a person who's grown up in poverty with an abusive father, with a system that does not care about her and only wants to use her.
Totally.
When the teacher calls them out, he shows so much more favoritism towards Marv than he does to Betty. He just makes like snide comments about her body, and it's really weird and creepy.
As does everyone else. Why is Marv dating her? Does he know anything about her? Do we know anything about her? No.
I mean, exactly. But that's all she can be seen as in this universe that the movie has created for us, right? All she is good looking.
Well, I think we do get a little bit more about her because we do know about what's motivating her. What does she want? She wants to get away from her father. She wants to show him that she can be successful. She wants to get out of this abusive household, and she is going to do it by any means possible. But the problem is, the thing that makes her a monster is that she undermines every avenue of success that could get her out of that household. She turns her two competing suitors on each other rather than just saying, go ahead, do your stuff. Whoever's the most successful, I'll just run away with you in the end. Because what does she care which of the two of them she ends up with?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's fair. No one in this film is particularly bright, but
No, it's true.
my point is that Betty is essentially Tracy Chapman in Fast Car.
Wow.
Except that Tracy Chapman in Fast Car has a better plan.
Yeah, but Tracy Chapman in Fast Car does not have two people going after her, and she ends up leaving with one.
This is a movie that's taking after movies like Rebel Without a Cause, except it's not well done, and society is to blame. Like, these are kids who are pushed to the brink by a society that doesn't care for them and can't provide for them.
Sure.
And yet, they also find time to paint Betty as a villain, as like the clear villain who is doing all sorts of things, despite the fact that other people are also doing terrible things. I mean, Betty gets shot by a guy who decides to shoot a guy and then gets upset and decides it's her fault.
It's true.
It's not her fault. She didn't actually do that, but
Very
she's an
true.
easy scapegoat, and the movie is willing to point that out while also making her an easy scapegoat.
Mhm.
I don't know.
While making her an easy scapegoat.
Yeah, like the
It's
movie is doing
true.
an interesting thing of having it both ways, I think.
Well, I mean, that is the problem with being the only female character inside of the entire movie,
That's true.
right? Is that you have to be both the temptation as well as the fall of man. So there it is. I mean, she's giving Marv some motivation for doing something. Marv doesn't actually seem all that excited to go to college
No.
or to get out of this life that he has. Like, he has tremendous faith in his father and also no faith in his father simultaneously. I think that this is something that's common in portrayals of children of alcoholic parents, that they're at once very like, yes, everything is going to change. I believe you that we're moving forward. Yes, this is the last time that's going to happen. Yeah, this time you will get a job. Yeah, this time we are going to be able to move out. And, you know, and yet at the same time, like, of course, this didn't work when things end up going badly. I mean, it happens in Pretty in Pink as well, which is very sad. Poor Molly Ringwald. She would not have been the villainess trying to have somebody else write her own paper.
Honestly, the English teacher might be the villain.
Ooh.
But he's just an emblem of society, you know?
R.I.P. Roger Corman, Chris.
Yeah, so Roger Corman passed away not too long ago as we are recording this. And so we decided to do one of the episodes that he's associated with. And I selected it because it was an episode that I wanted to watch again. And I'm glad we watched it. But you may have noticed, if you watched the credits carefully, that Roger Corman's name was nowhere to be found on it.
Yeah. So it's a Roger Corman movie. He's only, what, the producer?
He's the executive producer. He's uncredited. This film was distributed by Film Group, which Roger Corman founded with his brother Gene to distribute the films that he wasn't putting out with American International, where most of the Roger Corman directed films were produced and or distributed by American International. Their films had to be union shops. Film Group films didn't have to be union shops.
Oh.
So
Ooh.
basically, the Cormans made Film Group in order to distribute very low-budget films, such as High School Big Shot, as well as a few films that Roger Corman would make that just didn't seem like they had a natural home elsewhere, but they were often very cheaply made. And they were, profitable because Roger Corman cared about profit, but not necessarily wildly profitable. So eventually he stopped paying attention to Film Group. But this is one of the first films that they put out.
Yeah, he also did not seem to be very interested in wildly profitable. Like, he's not a guy whose purpose in life was to make one movie that made a lot of money. He was definitely in the volume game. Like, make a lot of movies cheaply, all of whom make a little bit of money, and that's enough. Because cumulatively, that's going to be making a lot of money. But no one film had to make a lot. Or so it seems from reading through some of the write-ups about him.
Yeah, that is very true. Before we go too far down that road, I just want to tag one thing that, as I understand it, Roger Corman came up with the idea for this movie and pitched it to the writer and director and then distributed it. So, it is somehow a Corman brainchild, but he didn't have a lot of direct involvement with making the film.
And had he made it 10, 15 years later, it would have had gratuitous nudity in some sort of way. I mean, this movie is so unlike the things that came out in the 70s with his name attached to it, in that there is no shower scene. There's no women in prison. I mean, there's so many things that could have been present that weren't.
Well, Corman moved with the times, right? Like you said, he was interested in putting out movies that made money. He was interested also in making art a bit, but the first time he made a movie that he thought was really gonna be art, it was an important movie for him, which was a movie he made with William Shatner.
The Intruder?
The Intruder.
Mm-hmm.
Little film about racism in the American South. He liked the film. It got good reviews. It didn't make money. He said, I'm not going to make that mistake again. But that was his 18th film, I want to say, 17th or 18th film. All of the rest of them made money.
Yes, and he was. I read about that one in one of the books that I read as well, because he had done all of these other movies. They had all done really well for these different production teams and these different distribution teams. So he was just like, I can make any movie I want, and these people will go with me on it because I've only made money for them. Why wouldn't they? And then he made this movie. He had to make it on his own dime. His brother had to mortgage his house to fund it. And it was just it didn't make money and nobody else would pick it up for him. And it was sorely disappointing for that reason.
It was also apparently a miserable shoot. They actually went to the South to film it, and they filmed it with locals, and it was
oh my gosh, can you
playing
imagine?
with fire. It was really uncomfortable the whole time, it seemed. That, it was a learning experience, I suppose. Yeah, so the book that I read for this was his book called How I Made 100 Movies in Hollywood and Never Lost a Dime.
Ooh.
Obviously, he lost a little bit of a dime on The Intruder, but,
Overall, didn't lose money.
He made 101 films, but 100 of them never lost a dime. And I feel like by now I've read several of these memoirs by directors who show up on MST3K a lot. Mm-hmm. And like all of them, it's kind of a random hodgepodge of memories about what's going on. But this was a pretty entertaining one, I thought. Pretty nicely written, lots of fun photographs in it. So, and I believe you looked at some of the books about him, and also you watched a documentary?
Yes, the documentary I watched was Roger Corman, the Pope of Pop Cinema.
Ooh.
So, which was just about an hour long. It included some interviews with Roger Corman inside of what looks like a very fancy office or home living room or whatever. It had some interviews with his brother, Gene Corman, as well. And it must have been filmed or released pretty close to the end of Gene's life, because it does have an RIP at the end of it for Gene Corman. Anyway, they also have some interviews with Joe Dante and Ron Howard, Howard, and some other directors that came up through what they called the Corman University of Filming. This also comes up in the book that I read, which was Teenagers, Cave Monsters. I don't have the title in front of me. I'm so sorry.
Crab Monsters, Teenage Cavemen, and Candy-Striped Nurses. Roger Corman, King of the Bee Movie.
Yes, that book was so much fun, actually.
Oh, good.
The reason why it was a lot of fun is because it not only included a whole bunch of quotes and interviews from not just directors, but also actors who had done a lot of work with Corman. And it had movie stills, and it also had posters for things that Roger Corman had made. It's incredible because the names that he worked with are names that are so well known to us. Not like Ron Howard. Like, who does not know Ron Howard as a director? But when he worked with Roger Corman, he wasn't a director. He was an actor that wanted to be a director, and he was young, right? Like in his early 20s, and no one would allow him to direct because he was an actor, not a director. And the big Hollywood studios just weren't willing to take chances with young actors or young directors, right? They wanted things to be a lot more establishment so that they knew that they were going to be making lots of money. And Roger Corman wasn't about making lots of money. He was about making enough money on a lot of films. It's a totally different philosophy. So he would work with unknowns like Jack Nicholson or Peter Fonda or Dennis Hopper or Ron Howard. And it's like, you've got to be flipping kidding me. These are not unknown names now. And it's because they got acting breaks from Roger Corman. He created opportunities for young actors and filmmakers and had them learn their craft while doing things. And Roger Corman could release these movies and make just enough money for it to be worth it.
It wasn't even just actors. Anybody who was working with him on anything could easily rise up through the ranks if they were a dedicated worker who were willing to make some sacrifices in order to be on a project and show their commitment to it. Like if you were willing to take on the authority, he was willing to give it to you, assuming he trusted your work, which he usually did. It seemed very no nonsense in this way. But also, what strikes me about it is that it kind of worked. Like, obviously, some Roger Corman movies are very bad and silly.
Yes.
But also, some of them are very good and competent. And and a lot of them, like, really are on the knife's edge, which is also kind of delightful. And that's just not how this story typically plays out. Typically, with a Graydon Clark or an Ed Wood, like, you end up in this weird family of the same people coming again and again, and you end up in these films that are sort of have their charms, but are not going to be, Little Shop of Horrors is a cult classic in a very different way from Plan 9.
Yes. Very, very much so.
Roger Corman is actually much more integrated into the system. He occasionally dabbled with making films for the majors. He just hated the lifestyle. He hated decision by committee. He hated all of this stuff. He hated the inefficiencies, how much money would be spent on things that didn't need to be spent, how much interference there were from other people who would dabble in scripts, executives tinkering with scripts just so that they could have a touch of it. Like, he didn't want any of that. He wanted complete control.
Yeah, he wanted to be able to choose his actors, right? I think there was some movie that he directed, and then he just stopped directing for 20 years because he was forced to have a very specific lead actor on the script because they told him who would be on it. And he was like, I don't want to have to do this. Like, I want to be able to make the choices that I want to make.
He also seems like he was a very straight-laced, details-oriented kind of guy.
It makes sense considering his degree is from engineering at Stanford and not in filmmaking. So for him to be a detail-oriented person is not wholly surprising.
That's true. Abby Dalton, who was one of the Viking women in the Sea Serpent and the yada yada, that movie,
Yes.
Describes Roger Corman as the first yuppie I ever met. And I believe that is just like, oh yeah, he's all business in a weird kind of way. I assume it's not massive cocaine use, but maybe. But he does take a drug at one point because after he filmed The Wild Angels, that biker film that we talked about during our summer of biker movies, he did a film about LSD in the early days of LSD called The Trip. and he wanted to do it right. So he went to Big Sur with people to guide him.
People like Jack Nicholson.
I think Peter Fonda was there, certainly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And let me read this bit for you.
Okay.
I took my acid in a sugar cube, and for a while, nothing happened. I thought, boy, what a waste. 400 miles up here for nothing. I'll wait a while longer, go out and get some wine, have some dinner, and go home to LA tomorrow. I decided to lie down. And then the acid kicked in. I spent the next 7 hours face down in the ground beneath a tree, not moving, absorbed in the most wonderful trip imaginable. Among other things, I was sure I had invented an utterly new art form. This new art form was the very act of thinking and creating, and you didn't need books or film or music to communicate it. Anyone who wanted to experience it would simply lie face down on the ground anywhere in the world at that moment, and the work of art would be transmitted through the earth from the mind of its creator directly into the mind of the audience. To this day, I'd like to think this could work and it would be wonderful. I think of all the costs you could cut in production and distribution alone.
That's pretty fabulous. I like that this vision of art, and it could cut so much costs.
Yeah. So yeah, he's willing to have this, magnificent moment, and then he makes a film which he attempts to be even-handed about LSD. He doesn't want to be pro-LSD, he doesn't want to be anti-LSD. The producers end up meddling with the cut to make it a bit more anti, and he gets very upset, whatever. He becomes known as a big, proponent of taking acid. He never took it again, he says, and I believe him. And his trip is like this wonderful journey that ends up with thinking about the business costs, thinking about how much money you could save if this is how we distributed art. I feel like that sums up a certain thing about Roger Corman right there.
I think there's something else about this movie that I read that also really speaks to Roger Corman's collaborative sense with the people he worked with, because when he was doing the trip, and he had this trip, which was very positive. He had a good trip, right? And everybody talks about there being lots of bad trips that are out there. He said to Peter Fonda or whoever he was working with, we can't just base it on my trip, because then it's going to look like an advertisement for all the positive things about LSD. We need things that happen in the movie that are going to also show the downside of it, because we can't make something that's just pro LSD. It'll never get distributed. And so he had Peter Fonda and Jack Nicholson writing things and having things happen inside of the movie that were bad trips, so that there would be this more balanced view of it. So he put that in other people's hands to help it happen, because he knew that the outcome had to be more balanced. And there's a lot of stories like that of him trusting people to direct second units, or trusting actors to change the scripts that they're being given before things go to production, so that nothing feels final. And it feels like there's a very collaborative atmosphere between any of the assistants that he has, any of the actors that are being involved, any of the writers that are involved, any of the art direction. It's not just I have a vision and you're executing my vision. It's very, let's work on this together, which is cool. What a nice set to be on.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like a really great working environment, even if it's a very difficult one and maybe not a well-paid one. It seems like one that has valid trade-ins for that I don't know, I'm not going to pretend everybody was into that trade-off and that you couldn't have good reasons for not wanting to be part of that. But for the right kind of person, and it seems like there were a lot of them, this was a really wonderful environment to make your first movie in, or make a bunch of movies in.
Yeah. One of the things that's weird, all of the interviews in the Popa Pop Cinema, as well as in the Crab Monsters book, they talk about Roger Corman as doing exploitation, right?
Yeah.
They talk about, not just exploitation of visuals of women's bodies or storylines or whatever, but also exploitation of people's time and working schedules because they're barely paying him. But none of them are talking about it negatively. And I don't know if there's a source out there where people talk about having a very bad experience working with Roger Corman. But certainly the sources that I was reading and watching don't seem to have people talking negatively about their experience. I guess I'm torn without having a counterpoint to all of this positive storyline for Roger Corman, but it seems like a lot of people were very grateful for the opportunity that he gave when no one else was giving opportunities for young actors and directors and writers.
Hey everybody, it's time for the Shallow 13.
Let's not do a Shallow 13. Listeners, Shallow 13 is the hardest part of the show to write. And sometimes you get halfway through it and you're like, you know what? Let's just talk about this instead. I want to do instead a very special Familiar Faces lightning round where we talk about a few of the faces that show up in both the movie and the short.
Chris, I feel like if we are going to replace the Shallow 13 with Familiar Faces deserves a jingle.
All right. Well, get one to me by Monday.
Familiar faces, familiar faces, familiar faces, familiar faces, familiar faces.
So here we go. First, let's do the short real quick. Out of This World. As I said, we don't know a lot about this movie. We don't know who directed it. We don't know who's playing the angel. We do know the guy who plays the devil is a guy named Ralph Clanton, who was in a bunch of little things. And we know the guy who plays the bread salesman, whose name is Joseph Campanella.
Oh.
Keep an eye out for Campanella as you watch your TV shows. He ends up in quite a lot of things. He played a guy that Mary used to have a thing for in an episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
What?
Yeah. And, of course, he made appearances in 2 episodes of Murder, She Wrote. We are contractually obliged to bring that up.
Obvious. Bonanza? No Bonanza?
No Bonanza, I'm afraid.
Okay.
No Bonanza. I think he was on Gunsmoke, but that's not Bonanza.
No, it's not.
He also eventually got nominated for a Tony and nominated for 2 Emmys.
Wow.
So that's all we've got. That's basically all we've got for Out of This World. Campanella's in a bunch of stuff. You can look it up if you want to. But High School Big Shot. 6 of High School Big Shot's actors showed up in Bonanza.
Best movie ever. I've changed my mind. What about Betty? Was Betty ever in Bonanza?
No, I'm afraid not.
Villain. She's the villain. That's the proof right there.
I suppose so. But Marv's dad is like Bonanza all over the place. Yeah, he is. Malcolm Atterbury is his name. He also showed up in I Was a Teenage Werewolf, which was riffed in season 8 with Michael Landon. And the other person that shows up in things, including Bonanza, was the safecracker, who was played by a guy named Stanley Adams.
Does he always wear that full 3-piece suit whenever he goes on his jobs in Bonanza as well?
I didn't see a clip of him on Bonanza, but he was in a few other things that you might have seen. He played a character named Rusty Trawler.
Whoa.
Who's a rich dude that Audrey Hepburn's character considers marrying in the film Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Fun times.
He also plays a guy named Cyrano Jones.
What? Who
would really like to sell you a tribble in the classic Star Wars episode.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So, he's an actor, as you might have been able to tell from his performance here, who is best suited for a character with a strong name.
And sales. He's very suited for sales.
He's very suited for playing somebody who, has taken an interest in money and its fineries. Otherwise, the other familiar face that I wanted to point out was the director, Joel Rapp. Only made one other film called Battle of Blood Island, which was based on a Philip Roth short story or something. That was also released by Corman through the same thing. Joel Rapp's brother, Paul Rapp, did a lot more collaboration with Corman over the years. But Joel Rapp sort of left the film world, went to television for a while, wrote the scripts for about 200 episodes of sitcoms like Bewitched,
Ooh.
and then made another big pivot in his life and he got into
Dentistry.
gardening.
Oh. Oh.
He went by the nickname Mr. Mother Earth, Plant Man to the Stars.
Oh my goodness.
Does that name ring a bell?
No, but it sounds awesome. Like I'm imagining him basically doing the garden designs for like all of the biggest stars that you can see when you go on the like bus tours of the stars' homes when you go down and you visit LA or something.
Yeah, he kind of did that, and he wrote several best-selling books about plant care. And if you're familiar with him, it might be because he ended up for 11 years as the gardener for Regis and Kathy Lee.
Stop it.
What a career arc.
They had a gardener on a morning show?
I mean, why not? Because then he's tending to the plants and you can ask him a question and he's called Mr. Mother Earth, Plant Man to the Stars. You have to imagine him in like a t-shirt that he made himself with a font in like Cooper Black or something.
Absolutely. No question. Yes. I can totally imagine Regis throwing to Mr. Mother Earth, Plant Man to the Stars. Like, absolutely, there's no question. And there's lovely house plants all over the set of Regis and Kathy Lee. I can't imagine that being a full-time job. That's all. But of course it is, because it's 5 days a week. Somebody's got to keep those plants alive. Regis isn't doing it.
Yeah, no, I mean, amazing. What an amazing career arc.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. That's not the usual success story that you expect for somebody coming out of the Roger Corman studios, the University of Corman, or whatever it is.
Yeah. Some people turn out to be Jack Nicholson. Some people turn out to be Mr. Mother Earth, Plant Man to the Stars.
Good for him.
Now, unfortunately, we have to talk about something very sad now.
Oh, okay.
Because a much less familiar face is Tom Pittman, who plays the troubled teen Marv, the star of our film.
Mm-hmm.
So, Tom Pittman, amongst other things, he'd been in a few TV shows and I think a movie or two before High School Big Shot. But he was a big fan of James Dean. Surprise, surprise. Guy playing a young teen actor. You've already figured out where this is going.
I mean, yeah.
Because Dean and Pittman both loved sports cars.
Mm-hmm.
Really fast sports cars.
Mm-hmm.
And like Dean, Tom Pittman died while driving very fast. He was, in fact, even driving the same model of car that Dean had died in, a Porsche Spider.
Wow.
And this happened when he was still quite young. I think he was 26. It was just a few months after the filming of High School Big Shot.
That's too bad.
It is very sad, yeah.
After watching that short, I've come to understand that with the limited shelf space available, I have to put more stock into specialty bread.
Bread, the staff of life. People got really into making it during lockdown.
They did. Did you get into making... You got into bread before lockdown. You're always ahead of the curve.
I was in lockdown decades before it became popular. But I know you, having lived with you for many years, I know that you are a big fan of sourdough bread in particular, you filthy Bay Area native. So did you end up snorting the Kool-Aid and making your own sourdough starter and nursing it carefully during lockdown?
Absolutely not. Chris, as you know, there's like only one place on earth that can ever make bagels, and that's New York. And there's only one place on earth that can ever make sourdough bread, and that's San Francisco. Like, it's something in the water. So unless you're making no, this is just not true. But it's one of those things that people put forth, right? That like only bagels from New York are real bagels, quote unquote. And there are bread makers in San Francisco that would also say only sourdough from San Francisco has the correct flavor because of something in the water there. So no, I have to admit, like during lockdown, I did not get into making bread. I tried to get yeast, as you might know. I don't know if the same was true up in Toronto, but you couldn't get flour You couldn't get yeast. Like, these things, as well as the toilet paper, flew off of the shelves and were not available.
Don't wipe your ass with flour.
It was so weird. There were bakeries inside of the area that were breaking apart the massive amounts of flour that they bought into household-sized containers so that you could purchase it from them, because they weren't able to bring in their workers and actually make their usual product line. So there was a way to get flour if you knew when these things were happening. But yeah, it was astonishing how hard it was to get the ingredients to make bread. Otherwise, I might have gotten into baking bread during lockdown, but there was no yeast to be found. Did you return to your bread baking ways during lockdown?
Yeah, I did not especially turn back to making bread. I may have made a little bit, but I didn't. It wasn't a big, exciting novelty for me, so I think I got hooked into other things instead. But I did go through a big bread making phase when I was in my 20s and living on my own and kind of poor, and making bread was cheap, and all you needed was time and some relatively cheap ingredients to make bread, right?
It's true.
So it was a good hobby to get into. It was a good place to explore. This brings us to the question of specialty breads, because while I did make a few breads more than once, I was more interested in trying all the different kinds of bread. Let's make one of each of all the different recipes I could find. And I made some breads that were fairly elaborate, involving, a bunch of figs and so forth, made in intricate patterns. I think it was a fig and almond bread that just took forever and was very tasty. I made some bialys, which are sort of like flat bagel related things. They're not bagels at all, but they're related. By the way, Montreal bagels are also real, but they're a different species than the New York bagel. So they're totally legit.
Entirely fair.
Anyway, they were really delightful and delicious, but they also took forever to make. But the thing that I made that was the most extreme, in a sense, was a kind of sourdough bread.
Oh.
It involved fermentation, like catching the yeast that just sort of lives around you naturally. And it involved apples.
It involved yeast and apples.
So you made a kind of apple mash that you mix in with flour and so forth as a starter, and then you let it out to ferment for like 3 weeks while tending to it, because it took a long time for it to gather enough yeast to properly work.
You weren't kidding when you said bread making takes time.
Yeah. I mean, this was an extreme example. Most breads, it takes half a day or 2 days or something, and you just set it and forget it for a while. This one, also a lot of setting and forgetting, but you had to nurse it every so often, like you would a sourdough starter, and it took so long to make, and it was so fiddly, and when it was done, it was fine.
Not worth it? Not worth it in terms of the time commitment?
Absolutely not.
Oh.
A simple overnight baguette kind of thing was much tastier than this ever was. Charlotte, you're a high school big shot.
I think by definition, if you're a teacher, you can't be the big shot.
I mean, you decide the grades.
That doesn't make me the big shot. That makes me the guy at his desk, like pointing the finger at Marv and Betty, being like, I know you didn't write this paper, Betty. Marv, you wrote this. That's not the big shot. That's totally different.
See, I think you were trying to do a voice there, but it just sounded like you. Like, is that what you're like as a teacher?
Yes, it's exactly what I'm like. You can ask all of my students. All I do is accuse them of cheating nonstop. And on my walls in the background, just to point out their terribleness, I have a picture of Abe Lincoln, Honest Abe, just so that everybody knows. I know when you're lying, just like the president.
So there's a trope, and maybe this was more true back in the day, of the president being on the wall of a classroom. Has that ever happened to you?
I was trying to think back if I remember any of the classrooms when I was a high school student and what were up on the walls. And I can't say that I remember there being a president on the walls, which I now share, I teach halftime, so I share a classroom with a government teacher. So we do have posters of the 3 branches of the American government on the wall. But mostly we have posters that are there to, I don't know, represent like the good things in our school and the good things in the world, and things like that. I do have Martin Luther King Jr. on the wall.
There you go.
With, with an inspirational quote, right? It's always the right time to do what's right, or something like that. We have a picture of Princess Leia, like, we the people rebel against hate. We have some iconic images that I think are showing up in classrooms more and more of a disability rights activist with another, like, we the people type of thing. Who else? There's I'm trying to think of what they are now. It's been so long since I've been in my classroom because it's summertime, everybody. Woo! Summertime. It's so good.
You've been off for like 2 weeks.
I know, but you know how quickly I purge that stuff? It's really fast. I'm going to go back in the fall and I'm going to have to learn like 250 children's names. And it's astonishing how much you don't have space, right, in the brain for all the things.
So the only artwork that I remember being on the walls of classrooms when I was a kid were those read posters, like library posters.
Yes.
With whoever in it, Han Solo or someone in it telling you to read.
Or the Think Differently posters that Apple put out it was advertising their product, but those were in classrooms when I was in school.
No, they weren't.
In college?
Think Different was from 1997 is when they put out that campaign.
I was in college in 1997.
Like, for a few minutes.
For long enough.
All right.
I remember those being in classrooms. Maybe it was when I went back to get my master's degree in teaching that they were inside of the classrooms, and I'm just blending them in my brain.
Maybe. That makes sense.
Anyway, I remember the Think Differently posters being up inside of classrooms because that's also like the read posters, something where you're trying to tie in iconic images.
Right.
Now they are very much like we have a disability icon, activist icon. We have a queer icon, right? People who are up on the walls talking about how we as a society value each other and we work together towards bettering everyone. Those kinds of things. There's also there's an Audre Lorde poster that was up in my classroom at one point in time, which I have since lost and I'm very sad about because she's amazing, right?
Yeah. She went to the same high school as me.
Did she really? Not at the same time, obviously.
Very much not at the same time. She was a few years before me, but yes.
One of the things our school has up now, and I think a lot of public spaces do, are land use acknowledgements.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
So we really appreciate that. I think they actually read a land use acknowledgement at the beginning of all of our school board meetings, which is phenomenal, right? Because there's one of those twice a month. So it is something that's happening publicly often. But mostly when I think of classroom decorations, I think of ones that are in movies that are specific, like this picture of Abraham Lincoln inside of High School Big Shot, where it's trying to make a point and set a scene inside of the background. I was trying to grab different high school movies just to see like, oh, what's inside of the background? And like, if you could think of what an art teacher's classroom should look like, what do you think would be inside of an art teacher's classroom?
Like posters of famous paintings, the Dali melting clock one, the maybe sunflowers. I don't know. Maybe something a little edgier if they're supposed to be a little edgier, but like not, inappropriate for the TV market.
Or inappropriate for teenageness. The art teacher's classroom that I was looking at in a movie is from the movie She's All That, because the main character is a artist who is going to go to art school, and she does performance art as well as painting. And the only teacher who's like a main character or even a character at all in that movie is her art teacher, who's trying to bring her out of her shell. And her classroom is all student work on the walls and shelves of supplies. And there's lots of easels up in the classroom where everybody's doing their art on it. So mostly it's supply oriented in terms of having lots of things available for students to be able to use. It looks like an incredibly expensive classroom because there's so much stuff for kids to use to make art, and that stuff is not cheap. So, but she has, like a head wrap turban on, and she's dressed pretty funkily, and she has an ostrich feather that she uses to just gently touch the students in an inspirational way, like, where's you in this painting? And then she brushes her with the feather. And it's like, oh my God, no one is like that in real life in teaching. But it's to create a mood, right? To create something about the character. It's in service of the teenage character, not in service of the classroom or her.
Are you telling me that She's All That isn't a documentary?
I know. Isn't it amazing?
Well, Charlotte, we have been talking for a good long while, and I'm going to have to do a lot of editing to get it under an hour, but we may be able to squeeze in one more final factoid. Do you have anything for me?
I have a super short one. Hopefully this is good. About an hour into the movie, the two characters of Marv and Betty are inside of a diner talking to each other about the plan, and Mike starts going, and that's all he does. And now Tom's Diner by Suzanne Vega is in my head forever, and now it's in yours too.
No, it's not, because here's a fun thing. You know how you get songs stuck in your head sometimes?
Uh-huh.
Used to plague me. Used to be a real problem. But I solved that problem. I no longer get songs ever stuck in my head. And you know why?
Why?
When I get a song stuck in my head, I start singing Tom's Diner to myself. I started doing this decades ago. That song was such an earworm that it would flush out anything else stuck in my head. And because I did it so often, I am immune to it getting stuck in my head itself.
So if I go, I would walk 500 miles and I would walk 5, you would go, da, 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 and it would flush.
Flush it out. And it became so effective that it became kind of a Pavlovian response. I just start thinking about Tom's Diner and whoosh, it's gone. I can do it so quickly. I don't really think I think about doing it anymore. I simply don't get songs stuck in my head like I used to. Also, that's the thing that tends to happen to young people more than older people, but that can't be why. It's because I've learned this trick.
I'm an old person and I have Tom's Diner stuck in my head. You're an old person and Tom's Diner is your flushing mechanism, but that doesn't mean that Tom's Diner is stuck in your head?
If it is, I stopped noticing it decades ago.
Wow. You're an icon, Chris.
Anyway, it doesn't have to be Tom's Diner, but pick a super catchy song that you can stand. And whenever you get another song stuck in your head, start playing that in your head. That will purge it out until finally you've reached perfect neutrality and all is good.
If you've been affected by the issues on this show, if you've ever been in a high school, or if you'd like to ask us anything, get in touch with us. Our email is info@itsjustashow.com, and we would love to hear from you. This show is made possible by listeners like you, and like our newest supporter, Mandrake. Thank you, Mandrake. For as little as $1 an episode, you too can be like Mandrake and help us research and record this show. You can join us in a friendly Discord, and you can listen to all our super fan bonus bits. Find out more at itsjustashow.com/Patreon or patreon.com/itsjustashow. And if you want to follow up on anything that was mentioned today, you will find links in our show notes at itsjustashow.com/episode/155. Mandrake was super excited that we were going to be doing High School Big Shot because it was one of their favorite episodes. Who can we get to be excited about our next episode, Chris?
All right, that's going to be a slightly tricky one because the next episode we're doing is a little bit of a weird one. We're going to be looking at KTMA episode 0.
What?
The Green Slime.
What?
It's not even a full episode. It's just the pilot, the proof of concept that they put together to share to the network. It's about 11 minutes long. We might have to watch the movie anyways. I'm sure it's great. I'm sure it's Rashomon. But but we'll have to find out. I've watched the pilot before, but I've never sat down to watch the entire film. So I'm going to give that a try. Hopefully I can find a copy. We'll see.
This is going to be exciting.
It is.
Everyone should be excited.
Yeah. But until then,
never put donuts next to the kitty litter.
I've never walked to the drive-in before. Take it away, Theme Squad.
Da, 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 da.